SciPod Books presents Lone Star Planet by H. Beam Piper and John J. McGuire. Read for you by Mark Douglas Nelson. Part 5 of Lone Star Planet by H. Beam Piper and John J. McGuire. Read for you by Mark Douglas Nelson. This here LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 9. The trial got started the next morning with a minimal amount of objections from Sydney. The charges and specifications were duly read, the three defendants pleaded not guilty, and then Goodham advanced with a paper in his hand to address the court. Sydney scampered up to take his position beside him. Your Honor, the prosecution wishes, subject to agreement of the defense, to enter the following stipulations, to wit, first, that the late Silas Cumshaw was a practicing politician within the meaning of the law. Second, that he is now dead, and came to his death in the manner attested to by the coroner of Sam Houston Continent. Third, that he came to his death at the hands of the defendants here present. In all my planning, I'd forgotten that. I couldn't let those stipulations stand without protest, and at the same time, if I protested the characterization of Cumshaw as a practicing politician, the trial could easily end right there. So I prayed for a miracle, and Clement Sydney promptly obliged me. "Defense won't stipulate anything," he barked. "My clients here are victims of a monstrous conspiracy. A conspiracy to conceal the true facts of the death of Silas Cumshaw. They ought never to have been arrested or brought here, and if the prosecution wants to establish anything, they can do it by testimony, in the regular and lawful way. This practice of free-wheeling stipulation is only one of the many devices by which the courts of this planet are being perverted to serve the corrupt and unjust ends of a gang of reactionary landowners." Judge Nelson's gavel hit the bench with a crack like a rifle shot. "Mr. Sydney, in justice to your clients, I would hate to force them to change lawyers in the middle of their trial, but if I hear another remark like that about the courts of New Texas, that's exactly what will happen, because you'll be in jail for contempt. Is that clear, Mr. Sydney?" I settled back with a deep sigh of relief, which got me, I noticed, curious stares from my fellow ambassadors. I disregarded the questions in their glances. I had what I wanted. They began calling up the witnesses. First, the doctor who had certified Ambassador Cumshaw's death. He gave a concise description of the wounds which had killed my predecessor. Sydney was trying to make something out of the fact that he was Hickok's family physician, and consuming more time when I got up. "Your Honor, I am present here as amicus curiae, because of the obvious interest which the government of the Solar League has in this case." "Objection!" Sydney yelled. "Please state it," Nelson invited. "This is a court of the people of the planet of New Texas. This foreign emissary of the Solar League, sent here to conspire with the New Texan traitors to the end that New Texas shall be reduced to a supine and ravished satrapy of the all-devouring empire of the galaxy," Judge Nelson rapped sharply. "Friends of the court are defined as persons having a proper interest in the case. As this case arises from the death of the former ambassador of the Solar League, I cannot see how the present ambassador and his staff can be excluded. Overruled." He nodded to me. "Continue, Mr. Ambassador." "As I understand, I have the same rights of cross-examination of witnesses as counsel for the prosecution and defense. Is that correct, Your Honor?" It was, so I turned to the witness. "I suppose, Doctor, that you have had quite a bit of experience in your practice with gunshot wounds?" He chuckled. "Mr. Ambassador, it is gunshot wound cases which keep the practice of medicine and surgery alive on this planet. Yes, I definitely have." "Now, you say that the deceased was hit by 6 different projectiles. right shoulder almost completely severed, right lung and right ribs blown out of the chest, spleen and kidneys so intermingled as to be practically one, and left leg severed by complete shattering of the left pelvis and hip joint? That's right. I picked up the 20mm auto rifle. It weighed a good 60 pounds from the table, and asked him if this weapon could have inflicted such wounds. He agreed that it both could and had. "This is the usual type of weapon used in your New Texas political liquidations?" I asked. "Certainly not. The usual weapons are pistols, sometimes a hunting rifle or a shotgun." I asked the same question when I cross-examined the ballistics witness. "Is this the usual type of weapon used in your New Texas political liquidations?" "No, not at all. That's a very expensive weapon, Mr. Ambassador. Wasn't even manufactured on this planet. Made by the Zisroff star cluster. A weapon like that sells for 500–600 pesos. It's used for shooting really big game, super mastodon and things like that, and of course for combat." "It seems," I remarked, "that the defense is overlooking an obvious point here. I doubt if these three defendants ever, in all their lives, had among them the price of such a weapon." That, of course, brought Sidney to his feet, sputtering objections to this attempt to disparage the honest poverty of his clients, which only helped to call attention to the point. Then the prosecution called in a witness named David Crockett Longfellow. I'd met him at the Hickok ranch. He was Hickok's butler. He limped from an old injury which had retired him from work on the range. He was sworn in and testified to his name and occupation. "Do you know these three defendants?" Goodham asked him. "Yeah, I even marked one of them for future identification," Longfellow replied. Sidney was up at once, shouting objections. After he was quieted down, Goodham remarked that he'd come to that point later, and began a line of questioning to establish that Longfellow had been on the Hickok ranch on the day when Silas Cumshaw was killed. "Now," Goodham said, "will you relate to the court the matters of interest which came to your personal observation on that day?" Longfellow began his story. "At about 0900 I was dusting up and straightening things in the library while the colonel was at his desk. All of a sudden he said to me, 'Davy, suppose you call the Solar Embassy and see if Mr. Cumshaw is doing anything today. If he isn't, ask him if he wants to come out.' I was working right beside the telescreen. So I called the Solar League Embassy. Mr. Thrombley took the call, and I asked him was Mr. Cumshaw round. By this time the colonel got through with what he was doing at the desk and came over to the screen. I went back to my work, but I heard the colonel asking Mr. Cumshaw could he come out for the day, and Mr. Cumshaw saying yes he could, he'd be out by about 10:30. Well, long about 10:30, his air car came in and landed on the drive. Little single-seat job that he drove himself. He landed it about 100 feet from the outside veranda, like he usually did, and got out. Then this other car came dropping in from out of nowhere. I didn't pay it much attention, thought it might be one of the other ambassadors that Mr. Cumshaw'd brung along. But Mr. Cumshaw turned around and looked at it, and then he started to run for the veranda. I was standing in the doorway when I seen him starting to run. I jumped out on the porch, quick-like, and pulled my gun, and then this auto rifle begun firing out of the other car. There was only 8 or 10 shots fired from this car, but most of them hit Mr. Cumshaw." Goodham waited a few moments. Longfellow's voice had choked, and there was a twitching about his face, as though he were trying to suppress tears. "Now, Mr. Longfellow," Goodham said, "did you recognize the people who were in the car from which the shots came?" "Yeah, like I said, I cut a mark on one of them. That one there, Jack High A. Bunny. He was handling the gun, and from where I was he had his left side to me. I was trying for his head,
but I always overshoot, so I have the habit of holding low. This time I held too low."
He looked at Jack High in coldly poisonous hatred.
"I'll be sorry about that as long as I live."
"And who else was in the car?"
"The other two curs out of the same litter, Switchblade and Turkey Buzzard, over there."
Further questioning revealed that Longfellow had had no direct knowledge of the pursuit or the siege of the jail in Bonneville. Colonel Hickok had taken personal command of that, and had left Longfellow behind to call the Solar League Embassy and the Rangers. He had made no attempt to move the body, but had left it lying in the driveway until the doctor and the Rangers arrived. Goodham went to the middle table and picked up a heavy automatic pistol.
"I call the court's attention to this pistol. It's an 11mm automatic manufactured by the Colt Firearms Company of New Texas, a licensed subsidiary of the Colt Firearms Company of Terra."
He handed it to Longfellow.
"Do you know this pistol?" he asked.
Longfellow was almost insulted by the question. Of course he knew his own pistol. He recited the serial number and pointed to the different scars and scratches on the weapon, telling how they had been acquired.
"The court accepts that Mr. Longfellow knows his own weapon," Nelson said. "I assume that this is the weapon with which you claim to have shot Jack High, Abe Bonney?"
It was, although Longfellow resented the qualification.
"That's all. Your witness, Mr. Sidney," Goodham said.
Sidney began an immediate attack. Questioning Longfellow's eyesight, intelligence, honesty, and integrity, he tried to show personal enmity toward the Bonnies. He implied that Longfellow had been conspiring with Cumshaw to bring about the conquest of New Texas by the Solar League. The verbal exchange became so heated that both witness and attorney had to be admonished repeatedly from the bench. But at no point did Sidney shake Longfellow from his one fundamental statement, that the Bonney brothers had shot Silas Cumshaw, and that he had shot Jack High Abe Bonney in the shoulder. When he was finished, I got up and took over. "Mr. Longfellow, you say that Mr. Thrombley answered the screen at the Solar League Embassy," I began. "You know Mr. Thrombley?"
"Sure, Mr. Silk. He's been out at the ranch with Mr. Cumshaw a lot of times."
"Well, beside yourself and Colonel Hickok and Mr. Cumshaw, and possibly Mr. Thrombley, who else knew that Mr. Cumshaw would be at the ranch at 10:30 on that morning?" "Nobody. But the air car had obviously been waiting for Mr. Cumshaw. The Bonnies must have had advance knowledge. My questions made that point clear despite the obvious, and reluctantly court-sustained, objections from Mr. Sidney."
"That would be all, Mr. Longfellow. Thank you. Any questions from anybody else?"
There being none, Longfellow stepped down. It was then a few minutes before noon, so Judge Nelson recessed court for an hour and a half. In the afternoon, the surgeon who had treated Jack High Abe Bonney's wounded shoulder testified, identifying the bullet which had been extracted from Bonney's shoulder. A ballistics man from Ranger Crime Lab followed him to the stand and testified that it had been fired from Longfellow's Colt. Then Ranger Captain Nelson took the stand. His testimony was about what he had given me at the embassy, with the exception that the Bonnies' admission that they had shot Ambassador Cumshaw was ruled out as having been made under duress. However, Captain Nelson's testimony didn't need the confessions. The cover was stripped off the air car, and a couple of men with a power dolly dragged it out in front of the bench. The ranger captain identified it as the car which he had found at the Bonneville jail. He went over it with an ultraviolet flashlight and showed where he had written his name and the date on it with fluorescent ink. The effects of the AA fire were plainly evident on it. Then the other shrouded object was unveiled and identified as the gun which had disabled the air car. Colonel Hickok identified the gun as the one with which he had fired on the air car. Finally, the ballistics expert was brought back to the stand again to link the two by means of fragments found in the car. Then Goodham brought Kettlebelly Sam Bonney to the stand. The mayor of Bonneville was a man of 50 or so, short, partially bald, dressed in faded blue Levi's, a frayed white shirt, and a grease-spotted vest. There was absolutely no mystery about how he had acquired his nickname. He disgorged a cud of tobacco into a spittoon, took the oath with unctuous solemnity, then reloaded himself with another chew, and told his version of the attack on the jail. At about 10:45 on the day in question, he testified, he had been in his office, hard at work in the public service, when an air car, partially disabled by gunfire, had landed in the street outside, and the three defendants had rushed in, claiming sanctuary. From then on, the story flowed along smoothly, following the lines predicted by Captain Nelson and Perros. Of course, he had given the fugitives shelter. They had claimed to have been near to a political assassination and were in fear of their lives. Under Sidney's cross-examination and coaching, he poured out the story of Bonneville's wrongs at the hands of the reactionary landowners, and the atrocious behavior of the Hickok goon gang. Finally, after extracting the last drop of class-hatred venom out of him, Sidney turned him over to me. "How many men were inside the jail when the three defendants were claiming sanctuary?" I asked. He couldn't rightly say, maybe 4 or 5. "Closer 25, according to the Rangers. How many of them were prisoners in the jail?"
"Well, none. The prisoners was all turned out that morning. They was just common drunks, disorderly conduct cases, that kind of thing. We turned them out so's we could make some repairs." "You turned them out because you expected to have to defend the jail, because you knew in advance that these three would be along claiming sanctuary, and that Colonel Hickok's ranch hands would be right on their heels, didn't you?" I demanded. It took a good 5 minutes before Sidney stopped shouting long enough for Judge Nelson to sustain the objection. "You knew these young men all their lives, I take it. What did you know about their financial circumstances, for instance?"
"Well, they've been ground down and kept poor by the big ranchers and the money guys."
"Then weren't you surprised to see them driving such an expensive air car?"
"I didn't know as it's such an expensive—"
He shut his mouth suddenly. "You know where they got the money to buy that car?" I pressed. Kettlebelly Sam didn't answer. "From the man who paid them to murder Ambassador Silas Cumshaw?" I kept pressing. "Do you know how much they were paid for that job? Do you know where the money came from? Do you know who the go-between was, and how much he got, and how much he kept for himself? Was it the same source that paid for that recent attempt on President Hutchinson's life?"
"I refuse to answer,"
the witness declared, trying to shove his chest out about half as far as his midriff.
"On the grounds that it might incriminate or degrade me."
"You can't degrade a bunny," a voice from the balcony put in.
"So then," I replied to the voice, "what he means is incriminate." I turned to the witness. "That will be all. Excused." As Bonnie left the stand and was led out the side door, Goodham addressed the bench.
"Now, Your Honor," he said, "I believe that the prosecution has succeeded in definitely establishing that these three defendants actually did fire the shot which, on April 22, 2193, deprived Silas Cumshaw of his life. We will now undertake to prove—"
Followed a long succession of witnesses, each testifying to some public or private act of philanthropy, some noble trait of character. It was the sort of thing which the defense lawyer in the Whately case had been so willing to stipulate. Sidney, of course, tried to make it all out to be part of a sinister conspiracy to establish a Solar League fifth column on New Texas. Finally, the prosecution rested its case. I entertained Gail and her father at the embassy that evening. The street outside was crowded with New Texans, all of them on our side, shouting slogans like "Death to the Bonnies!" and "Vengeance for Cumshaw!" and "Annexation now!" Some of it was entirely spontaneous, too. The Hickocks, father and daughter, were given a tremendous ovation when they finally left, and followed to their hotel by cheering crowds. I saw one big banner lettered, "Don't let New Texas go to the dogs," and bearing a crude picture of a Zasroff. I seem to recall having seen a couple of our Marines making that banner the evening before in the embassy patio. But...
Chapter 10. The next morning, the third of the trial, opened with the defense witnesses, character witnesses for the three killers, and witnesses to the political iniquities of Silas Cumshaw. Neither Goodham nor I bothered to cross-examine the former. I couldn't see how any lawyer as shrewd as Sidney had shown himself to be would even dream of getting such an array of thugs, cutthroats, sluts, and slatterns into court as character witnesses for anybody. The latter, on the other hand, we went after unmercifully, revealing, under their enmity for Cumshaw, a small, hard core of bigoted xenophobia and selfish fear. Goodham did a beautiful job on that. He seemed able, at a glance, to divine exactly what each witness's motivation was, and able to make him or her betray that motivation in its least admirable terms. Finally, the defense rested, about a quarter hour before noon. I rose and addressed the court. Your Honor, while both the prosecution and the defense have done an admirable job in bringing out the essential facts of how my predecessor met his death, there are many features about this case which are far from clear to me. They will be even less clear to my government, which is composed of men who have never set foot on this planet. For this reason, I wish to call, or recall, certain witnesses to clarify these points. Sidney, who had begun shouting objections as soon as I had gotten to my feet, finally managed to get himself recognized by the court. This Solar League ambassador, Your Honor, is simply trying to use the courts of the planet of New Texas as a sounding board for his imperialistic government's propaganda. You may reassure yourself, Mr. Sidney, Judge Nelson said. This court will not allow itself to be improperly used or improperly swayed by the ambassador of the Solar League. This court is interested only in determining the facts regarding the case before it. You may call your witnesses, Mr. Ambassador. He glanced at his watch. Court will now recess for an hour and a half. Can you have him here by 13:30? I assured him I could, after glancing across the room at Ranger Captain Nelson and catching his nod. My first witness that afternoon was Thrombley. After the formalities of getting his name and connection with the Solar League embassy on the record, I asked him, Mr. Thrombley, did you, on the morning of April 22nd, receive a call from the Hickok Ranch for Mr. Cumshaw? Yes, indeed, Mr. Ambassador. The call was from Mr. Longfellow, Colonel Hickok's butler. He asked if Mr. Cumshaw were available. It happened that Mr. Cumshaw was in the same room with me, and he came directly to the screen. Then Colonel Hickok appeared in the screen and inquired if Mr. Cumshaw could come out to the ranch for the day. He said something about super dove shooting. You heard Mr. Cumshaw tell Colonel Hickok that he would be out at the ranch at about 10:30? Thrombley said he had. And to your knowledge, did anybody else at the embassy hear that? Oh, no, sir. We were in the ambassador's private office, and the screen there is tap-proof. And what other calls did you receive prior to Mr. Cumshaw's death? About 15 minutes after Mr. Cumshaw had left, the Zsroff ambassador called, about a personal matter. As he was most anxious to contact Mr. Cumshaw, I told him where he had gone. Then, to your knowledge, outside of yourself, Colonel Hickok, and his butler, the Zsroff ambassador was the only person who could have known that Mr. Cumshaw's car would be landing on Colonel Hickok's drive at or about 10:30. Is that correct? Yes, plus anybody whom the Zsroff ambassador might have told. Exactly, I pounced. Then I turned and gave the three Bonney brothers a sweeping glance. Plus anybody the Zsroff ambassador might have told. That's all. Your witness, Mr. Sidney. Sidney got up, started toward the witness stand, and then thought the better of it. No questions, he said. The next witness was a Mr. James Finnegan. He was identified as a cashier of the Crooked Creek National Bank. I asked him if Kettle Belly Sam Bonney did business at his bank. He said yes.
"Anything unusual about Mayor Bonney's account?" I asked.
"Well, it's been unusually active lately. Ordinarily, he carries around 3,000 pesos, but about the 1st of April, that took a big jump. Quite a big jump. 250,000 pesos, all in a lump."
"When did Kettle-Belly Sam deposit this large sum?" I asked.
"He didn't. The money came to us in a cashier's check on the Ranchers Trust Company of New Austin, with an anonymous letter asking that it be deposited to Mayor Bonney's account. The letter was typed on a sheet of yellow paper in basic English."
"Do you have that letter now?" I asked.
"No, I don't. After we'd recorded the new balance, Kettle-Belly came storming in, raising hell because we'd recorded it. He told me that if we ever got another deposit like that, we were to turn it over to him in cash. Then he wanted to see the letter, and when I gave it to him, he took it over to a telescreen booth and drew the curtains. I got a little busy with some other matters, and the next time I looked, Kettle-Belly was gone and some girl was using the booth."
"That's very interesting, Mr. Finnegan. Was that the last of your unusual business with Mayor Bonney?"
"Oh, no. Then, about 2 weeks before Mr. Cumshaw was killed, Kettle-Belly came in and wanted 50,000 pesos, in a big hurry, in small bills. I gave it to him, and he grabbed at the money like a starved dog at a bone, and upset a bottle of red perma-ink, the sort we use to refill our bank seals. 3 of the bills got splashed. I offered to exchange them, but he said, 'Hell with it, I'm in a hurry,' and went out. The next day, Switchblade Joe Bonney came in to make payment on a note we were holding on him. He used those 3 bills in the payment. Then, about a week ago, there was another cashier's check came in for Kettle-Belly. This time there was no letter, just one of our regular deposit slips. No name of depositor. I held the check and gave it to Kettle-Belly. I remember when it came in, I said to one of the clerks, 'Well, I wonder who's going to get bumped off this time,' and sure enough."
Sidney's yell of "Objection!" was all his previous objections gathered into one. "You say the letter accompanying the first deposit, the one in basic English, was apparently taken away by Kettle-Belly Sam Bonney. If you saw another letter of the same sort, would you be able to say whether or not it might be like the one you mentioned?" Sidney vociferating more objections. I was trying to get expert testimony without previous qualification.
"Not at all, Mr. Sidney," Judge Nelson ruled. "Mr. Silk has merely asked if Mr. Finnegan could say whether one document bore any resemblance to another."
I asked permission to have another witness sworn in while Finnegan was still on the stand, and called in a Mr. Boone, the cashier of the Packers and Brokers Trust Company of New Austin. He had with him a letter, typed on yellow paper, which he said had accompanied an anonymous deposit of 200,000 pesos. Mr. Finnegan said that it was exactly like the one he had received, in typing, grammar, and wording, all but the name of the person to whose account the money was to be deposited. "And whose account received this anonymous benefaction, Mr. Boone?" I asked.
"The account," Boone replied, "of Mr. Clement Sidney."
I was surprised that Judge Nelson didn't break the handle of his gavel after that. Finally, after a couple of threats to clear the court, order was restored. Mr. Sidney had no questions to ask this time either. The bailiff looked at the next slip of paper I gave him, frowned over it, and finally asked the court for assistance.
"I can't pronounce this here thing at all," he complained.
One of the judges finally got out a mouthful of growls and yaps, and gave it to the clerk of the court to copy into the record. The next witness was a Zasroff, and in the new Texas garb he was wearing, he was something to open my eyes, even after years on the hooligan diplomats. After he took the stand, the clerk of the court looked at him blankly for a moment. Then he turned to Judge Nelson.
"Your Honor, how am I going to go about swearing him in?" he asked. "What does a Zasroff swear by that's binding?"
The president judge frowned for a moment.
"Does anybody here know Basic well enough to translate the oath?" he asked.
"I think I can," I offered. "I spent a great many years in our consular service before I was sent here.
We use BASIC with a great many alien peoples." "Administer the oath, then," Nelson told me. "Put up right hand," I told the Zasroff. "Do you truly say, in front of a great one who made all worlds, who has knowledge of what is in the hearts of all persons, that what you will say here will be true, all true, and not anything that is not true, and will you so say again at a time when all worlds end? Do you so truly say?" "Yes, I so truly say." "Say your name." "Pubamega Kovotumek Chichichi." "What is your business?" "I put things made of cloth into this world, and I take meat out of this world." "Where do you have your house?" "Here in New Austin, over my house of business on Coronado Street." "What people do you see in this place that you have made business with?" Pupamegal Kovutumek Chichichi pointed a three-fingered hand at the Bonney brothers. "What business did you make with them?" "I gave them money for a machine which goes on the ground and goes in the air very fast, to take persons and things about." "Is that the thing you gave them for money?" I asked, pointing at the exhibit air car. "Yes, but it was new then. It has been made broken by things from guns now." "What money did they give you for the machine?" 100 pesos. That started another uproar. There wasn't a soul in that courtroom who didn't know that 5,000 pesos would have been a giveaway bargain price for that car. "Mr. Ambassador," one of the associate judges interrupted, "I used to be in the used car business. Am I expected to believe that this being sold that air car for 100 pesos? "There's a notarized copy of the bill of sale from the office of the Vehicles Registration Bureau," I said. "I introduce it as evidence." There was a disturbance at the back of the room, and then the Zasroff ambassador, Gugulafer Destapatan Vuvuvu, came stalking down the aisle, followed by a couple of rangers and 2 of his attachés. He came forward and addressed the court. "May you be happy, sir, but I am in here so quickly, not because I have desired to make noise, but because it is only short time since it got in my knowledge that one of my persons is in this place. I am here to be of help to him that he not get in trouble, and to be of help to you. The name for what I am to do in this place is not part of my knowledge. Please say it for me." "You are a friend of the court," Judge Nelson told him, "and amicus curiae." "You make me happy. Please, go on. I have no desire to put stop to what you do in this place." "From what person did you get this machine that you gave to these persons for 100 pesos?" I asked. Gugulafer immediately began barking and snarling and yelping at my witness. The dry goods importer looked startled, and Judge Nelson banged with his gavel. "That's enough of that. There'll be nothing spoken in this court but English, except through an interpreter." "Yo, I am sad that what I did was not right," the Zasroff ambassador replied contritely. "But my person here has not as part of his knowledge that you will make him say what may put him in trouble." Nelson nodded in agreement. "You are right. This person who is here has no need to make answer to any question if it may put him in trouble or make him seem less than he is." "I will not make answer," the witness said. "No further questions." I turned to Goodham and then to Sidney. They had no questions either. I handed another slip of paper to the bailiff, and another Zasroff, named Babark Jonyekyeg Kekiki, took the stand. He put into this world things for small persons to make amusement with. He took out of this world meat and leather. He had his house of business in New Austin, and he pointed out the 3 Bonnies as persons in this place that he saw that he had seen before. "And what business did you make with them?" I asked. "I gave them for money a gun which sends out things of 20 millimeters very fast, to make death or hurt come to men and animals, and does destruction to machines and things." "Is this the gun?" I showed it to him. "It could be. The gun was made in my world. Many guns like it are made there. I am certain that this is the very gun."
I had a notarized copy of a customs house bill in which the gun was described and specified by serial number. I introduced it as evidence. "How much money did these three persons give you for this gun?" I asked.
5 pesos.
"The customs appraisal on this gun is 600 pesos, I mentioned. Immediately, Ambassador Vuvuvu was on his feet.
"My person here has not part of his knowledge that he may put himself in trouble by what he says to answer these questions."
That put a stop to that. Barak Jonyakyeg Kokiki immediately took refuge in refusal to answer on grounds of self-incrimination. "That is all, Your Honor," I said. "And now," I continued, when the witness had left the stand, "I have something further to present to the court, something both as amicus curiae and as ambassador of the Solar League. This court cannot convict the three men who are here on trial. These men should have never been brought to trial in this court. It has no jurisdiction over this case. This was a simple case of first-degree murder by hired assassins committed against the ambassador of one government at the instigation of another, not an act of political protest within the meaning of New Texan law." There was a brief silence. Both the court and the spectators were stunned, and most stunned of all were the three Bonney brothers, who had been watching, fear-sick, while I had been putting a rope around their necks. The uproar from the rear of the courtroom gave Judge Nelson a needed minute or so to collect his thoughts. After he had gotten order restored, he turned to me grim-faced.
"Ambassador Silk, will you please elaborate on the extraordinary statement you have just made?"
he invited, as though every word had sharp corners that were sticking in his throat. "Gladly, Your Honor." My words, too, were gouging and scraping my throat as they came out. I could feel my knees getting absurdly weak, and my mouth tasted as though I had an old copper penny in it. "As I understand it, the laws of New Texas do not extend their ordinary protection to persons engaged in the practice of politics. An act of personal injury against a politician is considered criminal only to the extent that the politician injured has not, by his public acts, deserved the degree of severity with which he has been injured, and the court of political justice is established for the purpose of determining whether or not there has been such an excess of severity in the treatment meted out by the accused to the injured or deceased politician. This gives rise, of course, to some interesting practices. For instance, what is at law a trial of the accused is, in substance, a trial of his victim. But in any case tried in this court, the accused must be a person who has injured or killed a man who is definable as a practicing politician under the government of New Texas. Speaking for my government, I must deny that these men should have been tried in this court for the murder of Silas Cumshaw. To do otherwise would establish the principle and precedent that our ambassador, or any other ambassador here, is a practicing politician, under, mark that well, Your Honor, under the laws and government of New Texas. This would not only make of any ambassador a permissible target for any marksman who happened to disapprove of the policies of another government, but more serious, it would place the ambassador and his government in a subordinate position relative to the government of New Texas. This the government of the Solar League simply cannot tolerate, for reasons which it would be insulting to the intelligence of this court to enumerate.
"Mr. Silk," Judge Nelson said gravely, "this court takes full cognizance of the force of your arguments. However, I'd like to know why you permitted this trial to run to this length before entering this objection. Surely you could have made clear the position of your government at the beginning of this trial."
"Your Honor," I said, "had I done so, these defendants would have been released, and the facts behind their crime would have never come to light. I grant that the important function of this court is to determine questions of relative guilt and innocence. We must not lose sight, however, of the fact that the primary function of any court is to determine the truth, and only by the processes of the trial of these depraved murderers for hire could the real author of the crime be uncovered. This was important, both for the government of the Solar League and the government of New Texas.
My government now knows who procured the death of Silas Cumshaw, and we will take appropriate action. The government of New Texas has now had spelled out, in letters anyone can read, the fact that this beautiful planet is in truth a battleground. Awareness of this may save New Texas from being the scene of a larger and more destructive battle. New Texas also knows who are its enemies, and who can be counted upon to stand as its friends.
Yes, Mr. Selk. Mr. Vuvuvu, I haven't heard any comment from you. No comment? Well, we'll have to close the court to consider this phase of the question.
The black screen slid up, for the second time during the trial. There was silence for a moment, and then the room became a bubbling pot of sound. At least 6 fights broke out among the spectators within 3 minutes. The rangers and court bailiffs were busy restoring order. Gale Hickok, who had been sitting on the front row of the spectator seats, came running up while I was still receiving the congratulations of my fellow diplomats.
"Stephen, how could you?" she demanded. "You know what you've done. You've gotten those murdering snakes turned loose."
Andrew Jackson Hickok left the prosecution table and approached.
"Mr. Silk, you've just secured the freedom of 3 men who murdered one of my best friends."
"Colonel Hickok, I believe I knew Silas Cumshaw before you did. He was one of my instructors at Dumbarton Oaks, and I have always had the deepest respect and admiration for him. But he taught me one thing, which you seem to have forgotten since you expatriated yourself, that in the diplomatic service, personal feelings don't count. The only thing of importance is the advancement of the policies of the Solar League."
"Silas and I were attachés together at the old embassy at Dramoul on Altair II,"
Colonel Hickok said. What else he might have said was lost in the sudden exclamation as the black screen slid down. In front of Judge Nelson, I saw there were 3 pistol belts and 3 pairs of automatics.
"Switchblade Joe Bunny, Jack High Abe Bunny, Turkey Buzzer Tom Bunny, together with your counsel, approach the court and hear the verdict,"
Judge Nelson said. The 3 defendants and their lawyer rose. The Bonnies were swaggering and laughing. But for a lawyer whose clients had just emerged from the shadow of the gallows, Sidney was looking remarkably unhappy. He probably had imagination enough to see what would be waiting for him outside.
"It pains me inexpressibly," Judge Nelson said, "to inform you that this court cannot convict you of the cowardly murder of the learned and honorable old man Silas Cumshaw, nor can you be brought to trial in any other court on New Texas again for that dastardly crime. Here are your weapons, which must be returned to you. Sort them out yourselves, because I won't dirty my fingers on them. And you may regret and feel shame for your despicable act as long as you live, which, I hope, won't be more than a few hours."
With that, he used the end of his gavel to push the 3 belts off the bench and onto the floor at the Bonnies' feet. They stood laughing at him for a few moments, then stopped, picked the belts up, drew the pistols to check magazines and chambers, and then began slapping each other's backs and shouting jubilant congratulations at one another. Sidney's 2 assistants and some of his friends came up and began pumping Sidney's hands.
"There," Gale flung at me. "Now look at your masterpiece. Why don't you go up and congratulate him, too?"
And with that she slapped me across the face. It hurt like the devil. She was a lot stronger than I'd expected. In about 2 minutes, I told her, "You can apologize to me for that, or weep over my corpse. Right now, though, you'd better be getting behind something solid."
Chapter 11.
I turned and stepped forward to confront the Bonnies, mentally thanking Gale. Up until she'd slapped me, I'd been weak-kneed and dry-mouthed with what I had to do. Now I was just plain angry, and I found that I was thinking a lot more clearly. Jack Bonnie's wounded left shoulder, I knew, wouldn't keep him from using his gun hand, but his shoulder muscles would be stiff enough to slow his draw. I'd intended saving him until I dealt with his brothers.
Now I remembered how he'd gotten that wound in the first place. He'd been the one who'd used the auto rifle out at the Hickok Ranch. So I changed my plans and moved him up to top priority. "Hold it!" I yelled at them. "You've been cleared of killing a politician, but you still have killing a Solar League ambassador to answer for. Now get your hands full of guns if you don't want to die with them empty." The crowd of sympathizers and felicitators simply exploded away from the Bonney brothers. Out of the corner of my eye, I saw Sidney and a fat, blousy woman with brass-colored hair as they both tried to dive under the Friends of the Court table at the same place. The Bonney brothers simply stood and stared at me, for an instant, unbelievingly, as I got my thumbs on the release studs of my belt. Judge Nelson's gavel was hammering, and he was shouting, "Court of Political Justice, Confederate Continent of New Texas, is herewith adjourned. Reconvene 0900 tomorrow. Hit the floor!" "Damn, he means it!" Switchblade Joe Bonney exclaimed. Then they all reached for their guns. They were still reaching when I pressed the studs, and the Krupp Tatas popped into my hands, and I swung up my right-hand gun and shot Jack High through the head. After that, I just let my subconscious take over. I saw gun flames jump out at me from the Bonnie's weapons, and I felt my own pistols leap and writhe in my hands, but I don't believe I was aware of hearing the shots, not even from my own weapons. The whole thing probably lasted 5 seconds, but it seemed like 20 minutes to me. Then there was nobody shooting at me, and nobody for me to shoot at. The big room was silent, and I was aware that Judge Nelson and his 8 associates were rising cautiously from behind the bench. I holstered my left-hand gun, removed and replaced the magazine of the right-hand gun, then holstered it and reloaded the other one. Hottie Ringo and Francisco Peros and Commander Stonehenge were on their feet, their pistols drawn, covering the spectator seats. Colonel Hickok had also drawn a pistol, and he was covering Sidney with it, occasionally moving the muzzle to the left to include the Zasroff ambassador and his 2 attachés. By this time, Nelson and the other 8 judges were in their seats, trying to look calm and judicial. "Your Honor," I said, "I fully realize that no judge likes to have his court turned into a shooting gallery. I can assure you, however, that my action here was not the result of any lack of respect for this court. It was pure necessity. Your Honor can see that. My government could not permit this crime against its ambassador to pass unpunished." Judge Nelson nodded solemnly. "Court was adjourned when this little incident happened, Mr. Silk," he said. He leaned forward and looked to where the 3 Bonney brothers were making a mess of blood on the floor. "I trust that nobody will construe my unofficial and personal comments here as establishing any legal precedent, and I wouldn't like to see this sort of thing becoming customary, but you did that all by yourself with those little bean shooters? Not bad at all, Mr. Silk." I thanked him, then turned to the Zasroff ambassador. I didn't bother putting my remarks into BASIC. He understood, as well as I did, what I was saying. "Look, Fido," I told him, "my government is quite well aware of the source from which the orders for the murder of my predecessor came. These men I just killed were only the tools. We're going to get the brains behind them, if we have to send every warship we own into the Zasroff star cluster and devastate every planet in it. We don't let dogs snap at us. And when they do, we don't kick them, we shoot them." That, of course, was not exactly striped pants diplomatic language. I wondered, for a moment, what Norman Gazarian, the protocol man, would think if he heard an ambassador calling another ambassador Fido. But it seemed to be the kind of language that Mr. Vuvuvu understood. He skinned back his upper lip at me and began snarling and growling. Then he turned on his hind paws and padded angrily down the aisle away from the front of the courtroom. The spectators around him and above him began barking, baying, yelping at him. "Tie a can to his tail! Get for home, Bruno!" Then somebody yelled, "Hey, look! Even his wristwatch is blushing!" That was perfectly true. Mr. Glaffer Dispaten-Vuvuvu's watch face, normally white, was now glowing a bright ruby red. I looked at Stonehenge and found him looking at me. It would be full dark in 4 or 5 hours. There ought to be something spectacular to see in the cloudless skies of Capella 4 tonight. Fleet Admiral Sir Rodney Tregaskis would see to that. From Report of Space Commander Stonehenge to Secretary of Aggression Klung. So, the measures considered by yourself and Secretary of State Gopal Singh and Security Coordinator Natalenko, as transmitted to me by Mr. Hadi Ringo, were not, I am glad to say, needed. Ambassador Silk, alive, handled the thing much better than Ambassador Silk, dead, could possibly have. To confirm Sir Rodney Tregaskis' report from the tales of the few survivors, the Zasroff attack came as the ambassador had expected. They dropped out of hyperspace about 70 light-minutes outside the Capella system, apparently in complete ignorance of the presence of our fleet. Have learned the entire fleet consisted of about 300 spaceships, and reports reaching here indicate that no more than 20 got back to Zasroff cluster. Naturally, the whole affair has had a profound influence, an influence to the benefit of the Solar League on all shades of public opinion. As you properly assumed, Mr. Hadi Ringo is no longer with us. When it became apparent that the Palm Silk Annexation Treaty would be ratified here, Mr. Ringo immediately saw that his status of diplomatic immunity would automatically terminate. Accordingly, he left this system, embarking from New Austin for Aldebaran 9, mentioning, as he shook hands with me, something about a widow. By a curious coincidence, the richest branch bank in the city was held up by a lone bandit about a half an hour before he boarded the spaceship. Final message of the last Solar Ambassador to New Texas, Stephen Silk. Copies of the Treaty of Annexation duly ratified by the New Texas Legislature herewith. Please note that the guarantees of non-interference in local political institutions are the very minimum which are acceptable to the people of New Texas. They are especially adamant that there be no change in their peculiar methods of ensuring that their elected and appointed public officials shall be responsible to the electorate. Department Addendum. After the ratification of the Palm Silk Treaty, Mr. Silk remained on New Texas, married the daughter of a local rancher there, see file on First Ambassador Colonel Andrew Jackson Hickok, and is still active in politics on that planet, often in opposition to Solar League policies, which he seems to anticipate with an almost uncanny prescience. Natalenko reread the addendum, pursed his thick lips, and sighed. There were so many ways he could be using Mr. Stephen Silk. For example, he looked at the Tri-D star map, both usefully and beautifully decorating his walls. Over there, where Hadi Ringo had gone, near Aldebaran 9. Those were twin planets, one apparently settled by the equivalent descendants of the Edwards, and the other inhabited by the children of a Jukes Kallikak union. Even the Solar League ambassadors there had taken the viewpoints of the planets to whom they were accredited, instead of the all-embracing view which their training should have given them. Curious problem, and how would Stephen Silk have handled it? The security coordinator scrawled a note comprehensible only to himself. The End of Lone Star Planet by H. Beam Piper and John J. McGuire. The End of Lone Star Planet by H. Beam Piper and John J. McGuire. Narrated by Mark Douglas Nelson. Music and effects by GarageBand. This here was a SciPod Books production.